So joining me now is Zoe Billingham, the Director of the Institute for Public Policy Research North, and joining us from Manchester. Zoe, thank you very much for your time today. This has been a pretty stumbling, chaotic last few days of the run-in towards this first anniversary. I mean, is that emblematic of the first year? How would you assess your top-line assessment of this first year in office?
I think that actually when you cut through the politics that can be somewhat chaotic, we've actually seen some decent down payments by the government in the last year, whether that's, changing the terms of the economy, changing those all important fiscal rules so they've been able to invest more than before, whether that's investing in clean and secure energy, and in other areas in regional policy, something that we care a lot about, IPPR North, we've seen the government make substantial commitments through the industrial strategy to the places across the country. So I think actually when you cut through the noise, there have been some significant investments.
But we have seen these pretty spectacular U-turns in recent weeks. We have seen this big gap in government funding, billions worth, opening up just in recent days. Is there not concern that what you call down payments, that the bills might be coming in and they might be quite difficult to pay in a few months' time?
Well, there's two things we're talking about here. On the one hand, there's the capital investment, the investment in our country's infrastructure, and the government has already given itself kind of the space and room to do that, whether that's in transport or in housing. But as you say, in the sort of day-to-day spending, how much government costs on an ongoing basis, I think there is an open question here about taxes. And we have been hearing a lot about that over the last few days. And it does seem that given the pressures on public services, the government will have to revisit the question of taxes later in the autumn.
And that impinges potentially on the government's key watchword throughout its first 12 months, growth, which has been pretty anemic and the outlook isn't much better.
Well, unfortunately, the kind of growth outlook across, say, the G7 is not so good at the moment, and there's a lot of international volatility. And of course, relatively speaking, we are doing better than other countries, even if, as you say, that growth is not where the government wants it. But look, I think there are ways that the government can look to raise further finances through taxation without having a strong impact on the growth of the economy. So I think the government still has options in that space. And ultimately, when you speak to the public, what they want is well-functioning public services, investment in our schools. They want that, public transport, especially in the north, as we've been held back for so long because of a lack of investment in that space. So actually, when you say to the public, these taxes are for an end, they are to improve your day-to-day living standards, I think you can quite clearly make the case for that.
But what metrics can you measure that against, particularly perhaps in the north, where you focus your attention? For instance, housing, big commitments of 1.5 million new homes during the course of this parliament. Again, that doesn't really look like it's on track at this point.
I think you're right that, whilst the government has been making down payments in the future, the public are, quite rightly wanting to see change happen soon. So the government's going to have to really think about what it's doing, particularly, say, on the cost of living, to make sure that people are feeling the impact of its policies today. But that shouldn't, negate the fact that we still need these down payments for public services, for housing in the future. And, it's a problem when people are so lacking in trust in politicians and politics that it's hard for the government to say, well, hang on a minute, actually, we have made these commitments, we are sticking to them and we are going to deliver them. So it's that trade-off really between both the government getting the kind of backing of the public for those long-term down payments, those long-term investments, whilst also realising that they have to help, people on the day-to-day and the cost of living up front. And to your point on the kind of overall measure, obviously the government's made growth its mantra of this government, and that's critically important, but it's not the end game. It's growth is a means to improve living standards. And so really what this all connects to, whether it's housing policy, whether it's changes to fiscal rules, all of these add up to how is it impacting people's living standards now, and how will it impact people's living standards in the long run? And for me, that is the ultimate indicator of whether the government has been a success.
But people also look to their leaders and the personalities and the performance of those leaders. I mean, we saw those extraordinary scenes in the Commons yesterday, real political drama with Rachel Reeves looking so upset behind the Prime Minister. He is, of course, saying that she has his full faith that she will be Chancellor even beyond the next election, that they are in lockstep. But we saw the markets moving, the bond markets moving during that entire episode. So what does it say about the leadership team, about her position, given that the bond markets obviously want her to be there, but they've demonstrated as a pairing that they are liable to be pushed around by their backbenchers?
Well, I think we shouldn't be too drawn in by the sort of melodrama that, the Westminster bubble sort of likes to create around individual politicians and dynamics. And actually, if Number 10 have said the Chancellor has their full backing, then, we should take that as their position. So I hope the bond markets and everyone else will follow suit. But ultimately, there was rumours of a reshuffle in the summer. We don't know yet when that's going to happen, and that will be for the Prime Minister to decide.
So I guess that the strategy now, or reports are anyway, that it is to get through the summer, get to the budget. But that budget becomes all the more crucial, both politically and economically now. What are you expecting to see?
Absolutely. Well, we had the comprehensive spending review a couple of weeks ago, where actually government, did turn a corner away from the previous government spending plans, which really baked in austerity, and they've really turned the page on that, and there will be an overall spending increase. So in some senses, we already have the certainty that many public services are going to get the investments they need. I suppose the kind of big unknowns are still, as I say, on taxes, and whether the government will need to revisit that position, given the state of our public services that they inherited. But also, of course, with the international volatility and the renewed emphasis on defence spending, of course, that does then create trade-offs between sort of domestic policy and international policy. So I imagine those will be the two big ticket items that the government will have to consider in the autumn.
And that spending review was very much front-loaded. The spending sort of tapers towards the end of the Parliament at precisely the time when, if the sorts of outcomes from that spending aren't really feeding through ahead of an election coming up, it could put further pressure on the government to spend more, potentially tax more.
Well, I think the spending review has set out, as I say, a kind of overall real terms increase in spending. So there was a bit of a sigh of relief across many areas of government spending and in the wider sector about that. So it's kind of then up to the government to assess the kind of renewed pressures in the autumn. But I think for the time being, they've done a decent job of putting those down payments down for the next few years. And of course, that is the last big comprehensive spending review, dare I say, before the next general election. So it really mattered.
All right, Zoe Billingham, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.